The dust never settled in Copper Ridge. It hung in the air like judgment itself, coating everything with the same dull brown that seemed to seep into folks' souls. Cassandra Mitchell had once thought this town held promise. She'd arrived 3 years ago with her teaching certificate and a heart full of hope, believing she could make a difference in this rough frontier settlement. Now she sat in the cramped jail cell, her once pristine blue dress torn and stained, watching Sheriff Tom Bradley avoid her eyes as he slid a tin plate of beans through the bars. The food was cold, congealed, but hunger had become her constant companion these past weeks. "Eat up, Miss Mitchell," Bradley muttered. His weathered face creased with what might have been regret. "Town council's meeting tonight to decide your situation." Cassandra's fingers trembled as she picked up the spoon. She knew what that meant. Everyone in Copper Ridge knew. The situation had been brewing ever since Harold Wade's son Marcus had spread his poison through the town like wildfire through dry grass. It had started innocently enough. Marcus Wade, barely 18 and cocky with his father's money and influence, had lingered after her lessons, asking questions about literature that had nothing to do with learning, when she'd maintained proper boundaries, refusing his increasingly bold advances. His admiration had curdled into something ugly. The accusation came on a Tuesday morning in September. Marcus claimed she'd made improper advances toward him, painting himself as an innocent victim of a desperate spinster's attentions, in a town where Harold Wade owned half the businesses and held mortgages on most of the rest. Marcus's word carried the weight of law. Within a week, Cassandra had lost her position at the schoolhouse. Within 2 weeks, she couldn't find work anywhere in town. The same women who'd once invited her to quilting circles now crossed the street when they saw her coming. The men who'd tipped their hats respectfully now looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and something worse. Shameful. She'd heard Mrs. Adelaide Porter whisper to her companion outside the general store, a woman of her education, taking advantage of that poor boy. What's this world coming to? The irony cut deep. Cassandra had dedicated her life to education, to molding young minds with patience and care. She'd never so much as raised her voice inappropriately to a student, let alone done what Marcus claimed. But truth was a luxury this town couldn't afford when Harold Wade held the purse strings. Desperation had driven her to take the bread. 3 days without food, her savings exhausted, landlord demanding rent she couldn't pay. She'd seen the fresh loaf cooling on Baker Wilson's windowsill and made a choice that condemned her. The theft of a single loaf of bread, worth maybe 15 cents, had sealed her fate. Thieving on top of everything else. Mayor Richards had declared at her sentencing, "This woman's a danger to our community's moral fiber." Now, as evening shadows crept across her cell floor, Cassandra heard the murmur of voices from the town hall next door. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her father's face, his voice reading scripture by lamplight in their Ohio home. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Cassie girl," he used to say. "Sometimes what looks like an ending is just a different kind of beginning." The voices next door grew louder, more agitated. She caught fragments through the thin walls. Burden on the community. Waste of resources. Example must be made. Harold Wade's booming voice rose above the rest. "Gentlemen, we all know keeping her fed and housed in that cell costs money this town doesn't have. And for what? She'll just be released eventually to cause more trouble. I say we solve 2 problems at once." A hush fell, followed by nervous murmurs. Cassandra pressed closer to the wall, her heart hammering. "The Apache raids have cost us plenty," Wade continued. "Lost 3 good men last month alone. That blood hunter of theirs has been particularly troublesome. What if we offered a gesture of goodwill? 1 woman for the promise of peace." "Harold, you can't be serious." "Doctor," Franklin's voice, thin with horror. "That's practically murder." "Is it, or is it justice? She's caused nothing but trouble since she arrived, and everyone knows what the Apache do with their gifts. Quick end to a problem that's been festering too long." More murmurs, some protesting, others thoughtful. Mayor Richards spoke up. The blood hunter's been quiet lately. Might work, might buy us some time. You're talking about sacrificing a human being. Doctor, Franklin insisted. I'm talking about protecting this community. Wade shot back. That woman has corrupted our children, stolen from honest folks, and shown no remorse. Let her serve some purpose for once. The debate raged for another hour. Cassandra sank to her knees on the cell floor, the weight of their words crushing down on her. She'd heard the stories about the Apache warrior they called Blood Hunter, a tall, silent figure who appeared without warning, who left no witnesses to his raids. The very mention of his name could silence a saloon full of rough men. They were going to give her to him, trade her life for the illusion of safety. When Sheriff Bradley finally appeared with his keys, his face was pale as moonlight. I'm sorry, Miss Mitchell, I truly am, but the council's decided tomorrow morning we make the exchange. An exchange? Her voice came out barely a whisper. The Apache blood hunter, he's been receptive to certain arrangements in the past. The council believes. Bradley couldn't meet her eyes. They believe it's for the greater good. Cassandra stared at him, seeing not cruelty but cowardice. These weren't evil men, just frightened ones, choosing the easy path over the right one. In that moment, she felt something inside her shift. The fear remained, but underneath it, something harder began to form. I see, she said quietly. And when does this greater good take place? Dawn, the Apache will meet us at Devil's Canyon. Bradley's hands shook as he locked the cell. Miss Mitchell, I want you to know, this isn't how I wanted things to go. After he left, Cassandra sat in the darkness and listened to the night sounds of Copper Ridge dogs barking, a piano playing badly in the saloon, the whistle of wind through the gaps in the jail's wooden walls. Tomorrow, she would leave this place forever. Whether she would live to see another sunset remained to be seen, but for the first time since Marcus Wade had destroyed her life with his lies, Cassandra Mitchell felt something besides despair. She felt angry, and anger. She was beginning to understand. Might be exactly what she needed to survive whatever came next. The dust might never settle in Copper Ridge, but tomorrow, she would shake it from her feet for the last time. Dawn came too soon and not soon enough. Cassandra had spent the night listening to her own heartbeat, wondering if each rhythm might be among her last. When Sheriff Bradley appeared with her breakfast, actual eggs and bacon, a mercy meal, she ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Time to go, Miss Mitchell. The words she'd been dreading. Bradley's voice held the flat tone of a man doing distasteful work. Behind him stood Deputy Cole Hutchins, young and nervous, his hand resting on his gun belt more for comfort than threat. They walked her through the back streets of Copper Ridge, avoiding the main thoroughfare where curious eyes might witness this shameful parade. But word had spread, as it always did in small towns. Faces appeared in windows, peering through lace curtains. Children were quickly pulled inside by their mothers. Mrs. Porter stood in her doorway, arms crossed, watching with the satisfaction of someone seeing justice done. Should have thought of the consequences before you started your wicked ways, she called out, loud enough for the whole street to hear. Cassandra kept her eyes forward, her chin raised. If these were to be her final moments in civilization, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The wagon ride to Devil's Canyon took an hour, the wooden seat jolting with every rut in the dusty trail. Mayor Richards sat across from her, his pale hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Harold Wade rode his own horse alongside, his face set in grim satisfaction. You understand, Richards said suddenly, his voice barely audible over the wagon wheels. This isn't personal, Miss Mitchell. It's simply practical. Cassandra looked at him. This man who'd once praised her dedication to education, who'd shaken her hand at church social events. Practical, she repeated. Yes, I suppose trading human lives often is. Richards flinched and said nothing more. Devil's Canyon earned its name from the way the wind howled through its red rock formations. creating sounds like voices crying out in anguish. It was a fitting place for what the town council considered justice. The narrow passage between towering stone walls had seen its share of blood over the years. Apache raids, cavalry skirmishes, the occasional duel between hot-headed cowboys. They stopped where the canyon opened into a wider bowl surrounded by rust-colored cliffs. The morning sun cast everything in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and terrible at once. A small group from town had gathered, the council members, a few prominent citizens, and Sheriff Bradley's unofficial posse. All men, Cassandra noted. The women of Copper Ridge might whisper about her fate, but they wouldn't dirty their hands witnessing it. "He'll come," Wade said, checking his pocket watch. "Always punctual. This one." They waited in the desert silence, broken only by the nervous shuffling of horses and the whispered conversations of men trying to convince themselves they were doing right. Cassandra sat in the wagon bed, hands folded, studying the faces around her. Fear radiated from them like heat from a cook stove. Whatever they knew about this blood hunter, it was enough to make grown men sweat in the cool morning air. The first sign was the horses. They began to shift restlessly, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Then came the sound hoofbeats, but wrong somehow. Too rhythmic, too controlled. A horse and rider moving as one unit across terrain that should have demanded careful navigation. He appeared at the canyon's mouth like a shadow given substance. Tall, mounted on a paint horse that seemed to flow rather than gallop across the broken ground. Even at a distance, Cassandra could see why they called him Blood Hunter. He sat his horse with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle, and something about his stillness suggested coiled violence. The men of Copper Ridge instinctively clustered together, hands drifting toward weapons they hoped they wouldn't need to use. Harold Wade stepped forward, playing the role of spokesman for this grim delegation. "You came," Wade called out, his voice carrying a forced heartiness. "Good, good. We have what we discussed." The Apache warrior rode closer, and Cassandra got her first clear look at him. Younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 years old, with strong features and dark hair that caught the morning light. He wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with pieces clearly taken from white settlements, buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt, a gun belt that had probably belonged to a cavalry officer. But it was his eyes that held her. Dark, intelligent, missing nothing. They swept over the assembled townsmen with the careful assessment of a predator evaluating threats. When his gaze fell on her, sitting in the wagon like cargo, awaiting delivery, something flickered across his features too quickly to interpret. He brought his horse to a stop 20 feet away, close enough to speak, far enough to react if this was a trap. When he spoke, his English was clear, unaccented, surprising several of the men. "You bring me a woman." It wasn't a question. Wade nodded eagerly. "As agreed. One woman for considerations. She's been nothing but trouble for our community. Theft, corruption of youth, general moral degradation." The Apache's eyes returned to Cassandra. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away. If she was going to die, she would do it with dignity. "Get down!" The command was quiet, but carried absolute authority. Wade gestured frantically at Deputy Hutchins, who approached the wagon with obvious reluctance. "Come on, then," Hutchins muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Cassandra climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the ride. She stood in the dust of Devil's Canyon, surrounded by men who'd decided her fate, facing the warrior who would determine whether she saw another sunset. The Apache swung down from his horse with fluid grace, and Cassandra realized just how tall he was. Well over 6 feet, with the broad shoulders and lean build of someone accustomed to physical hardship. He approached slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, though the men of Copper Ridge tensed as if watching a wild animal. When he stood before her, close enough that she could see the intricate beadwork on his shirt, he spoke again. "They tell you why you're here?" His voice was softer than she'd expected, But there was something in it. Not kindness, exactly, but perhaps curiosity. Cassandra lifted her chin. They tell me I'm payment for their peace of mind. Something that might have been approval flickered in his dark eyes. And you believe this is justice? I believe, Cassandra said carefully, that frightened people often make choices they wouldn't make otherwise. The warrior studied her for a long moment. Around them, the silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Harold Wade shifted impatiently. Well, Wade demanded, do we have an agreement or not? The Apache turned to face the assembled men, and Cassandra saw several of them step back involuntarily. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of stone. I take her. Wade's relief was palpable. Excellent. Then we can consider our understanding renewed. For now. The warrior returned to his horse and pulled something from his saddlebags. A length of rope. But instead of binding her hands as she'd expected, he handed it to her. Hold this. Confused, but compliant, Cassandra took the rope. The Apache mounted his horse and gestured for her to walk beside him. As they moved toward the canyon mouth, she heard Mayor Richards call out behind them. Miss Mitchell, for what it's worth, I hope you find peace. She didn't turn around. They walked in silence until the voices of Copper Ridge faded behind the canyon walls. Only then did the Apache speak again. You can let go of the rope now. Cassandra looked down at her hands, realizing she'd been gripping the cord like a lifeline. I don't understand. They needed to see you as my captive. Now they have. He slowed his horse to keep pace with her walking. What is your name? Cassandra Mitchell. I am Nahuel. The name meant nothing to her, but something in the way he said it suggested it was important. They continued walking, leaving Devil's Canyon and the town that had rejected her far behind. The desert stretched endless before them, beautiful and deadly under the climbing sun. Where are we going? She asked finally. Nahuel looked down at her from his horse, and for the first time, she saw something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Away from them. Beyond that, you'll have to decide for yourself. It was then that Cassandra Mitchell realized something that would have shocked the good people of Copper Ridge. For the first time in months, she felt safe. The Arizona desert had a way of stripping everything down to what mattered. As they left Devil's Canyon behind, Cassandra felt the last threads connecting her to Copper Ridge snap one by one. The dust, the whispered accusations, the weight of disappointed expectations. All of it fell away with each step into the vast wilderness. Nahuel rode in silence for the first hour, his paint horse picking its way carefully across terrain that looked impossible to navigate. Red rocks jutted from the earth like ancient monuments, and the sun climbed higher, promising brutal heat by midday. Cassandra's worn boots, suitable for schoolhouse floors and church socials, were already rubbing blisters. We'll stop soon, Nahuel said without looking down at her, as if he'd sensed her discomfort. How did you know? Your breathing changed, and you're favoring your left foot. She glanced up at him, surprised by his observation. In Copper Ridge, men barely noticed women unless they needed something from them. This man missed nothing. They stopped beside a cluster of barrel cacti, their shade offering minimal relief from the climbing sun. Nahuel dismounted and pulled a leather water bag from his saddle, offering it to her without ceremony. The water was warm, but clean, tasting of nothing but life itself. Cassandra drank carefully, remembering her father's stories about desert travelers who died with water in their packs because they'd rationed it too strictly. Drink more, Nahuel said, watching her. Desert will take everything you don't give it first. She drank again, longer this time, and felt some of her strength return. Nahuel took the bag back and allowed himself a small sip before hanging it on his saddle. You could have killed me back there, Cassandra said suddenly. They expected you to. Why didn't you? Nahuel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. Because I know what it is to be given away by people who should protect you. Something in his tone discouraged further questions. Instead, she watched as he pulled dried meat and corn cakes from his saddlebags, offering her half without comment. The food was simple but filling, and she realized she was hungrier than she'd admitted. "The townspeople," she said between bites. "They seem to know you." "We have arrangements. Sometimes." "What kind of arrangements?" Nahuel's dark eyes studied her. The kind that keep both sides alive a little longer. As they ate, Cassandra found herself studying this man who'd become her unexpected savior. The stories in Copper Ridge painted him as a monster, a savage who took scalps and left no survivors. But the man sitting across from her shared his food and water, spoke educated English, and had shown her more kindness in one morning than her own community had managed in months. "They called you Blood Hunter." "Names are weapons," he said simply, "sometimes useful ones." "Is that your real name?" "Nahuel is real enough." He finished his food and stood, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. "We should move. Heat gets worse before it gets better." They resumed their journey, heading deeper into country that seemed untouched by civilization. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against the blue sky, their arms raised in eternal supplication. In the distance, mountains wavered in the heat haze, purple and mysterious. "Where are we going?" Cassandra asked as they navigated around a particularly treacherous stretch of loose rock. "It depends." "On what?" "On what you want." The question caught her off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked her what she wanted? In Copper Ridge, her wants had been irrelevant, first as a woman, then as an accused criminal. The possibility of choice seemed as foreign as the landscape around them. "I don't know," she admitted. "Then we go where the land takes us until you decide." By midday, the heat had become a living thing, pressing down on them with crushing weight. Cassandra's dress clung to her skin, and sweat stung her eyes. She'd never experienced anything like this oppressive furnace that seemed to suck moisture from her body with every breath. Nahuel called another halt beside a rare spring, little more than a seep in the rocks that had created a small pool surrounded by green grass. It was an oasis that would have seemed impossible if she wasn't seeing it with her own eyes. "Rest," he said, dismounting. "Desert kills the stubborn." Cassandra sank gratefully into the shade of a cottonwood tree, its leaves whispering in the faint breeze. Nahuel tended to his horse first, a magnificent paint with intelligent eyes and a coat that seemed to shimmer in the dappled light. "She's beautiful," Cassandra said, watching the mare drink from the spring. "Her name is Ayana. It means eternal blossom." "That's a lovely name." "My grandmother chose it." Something shifted in his expression, a shadow of old grief. She said some things bloom even in the hardest ground. They rested through the worst heat of the day, and Cassandra found herself studying Nahuel when she thought he wasn't looking. He moved with the confidence of someone completely at home in this harsh environment, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to her. When a hawk circled overhead, he watched its flight pattern with interest. When the wind shifted, he lifted his head like a wolf scenting danger. "You weren't always here," she said eventually. "In the desert, I mean." He glanced at her. "What makes you say that?" "Your English. It's too good. Too—" She searched for the word. "Formal." "Mission school," he said after a pause. "San Xavier, the priests thought they could make me into something I wasn't. Did they succeed? Depends how you look at it. They taught me to read their books, speak their language, understand their ways of thinking." His smile held no warmth. "Made me useless to both worlds." Cassandra recognized something in his voice, the isolation of someone caught between two lives, belonging fully to neither. It was a feeling she understood all too well. "The townspeople are afraid of you. Fear is another useful tool. But not the whole truth." Nahuel was quiet for a long time. watching his horse graze in the small patch of grass. Truth is complicated. Sometimes the legend serves better than the man. As afternoon began to cool into evening, they resumed their journey. The landscape gradually changed, red rocks giving way to rolling hills covered in mesquite and palo verde trees. In the distance, Cassandra could see the dark line of mountains, their peaks catching the last golden light of day. "How far?" she asked, though she wasn't sure what she was asking the distance to. "Depends where we're going." "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." Nahuel's horse picked its way carefully down a steep slope scattered with loose stones. "Most people spend their lives going where others tell them to go. You have a chance to choose your own direction." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. In Ohio, her path had been clear school, teaching, perhaps marriage to a suitable man. In Copper Ridge, that path had been destroyed by lies and fear. Now, walking beside this enigmatic warrior through country that existed outside the boundaries of civilization, she felt as though she stood at the edge of a vast ocean of possibility. What if I choose wrong? Wrong for who? The question lingered as they made camp that evening beside a dry wash lined with mesquite trees. Nahuel gathered deadwood with practiced efficiency while Cassandra attempted to help, fumbling with branches that seemed determined to tangle in her skirts. "Here," he said, showing her how to break the wood properly. "Let the grain guide you. Fight it, and it fights back." The fire, when he lit it, seemed like magic after the oppressive heat of the day. As darkness fell, the desert transformed. The crushing silence gave way to a symphony of night sounds. Coyotes calling in the distance, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through the trees. "It's beautiful," Cassandra said, looking up at stars more brilliant than any she'd seen in Ohio or Copper Ridge. "Desert keeps its beauty for those who respect it." They shared another simple meal, and Cassandra found herself watching Nahuel across the firelight. The flames cast shadows across his features, highlighting the strong lines of his face and the intelligence in his dark eyes. He was nothing like the monster the people of Copper Ridge believed him to be. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally. "Maybe I didn't help you. Maybe you helped me." "How?" "By reminding me that not all gifts are poisoned." Later, as she lay wrapped in a blanket Nahuel had provided, staring up at the infinite canopy of stars, Cassandra Mitchell realized something that would have shocked her former self. For the first time in her adult life, she felt free. The desert might be harsh and unforgiving, but it made no judgments. It simply was, accepting or rejecting based on strength and wisdom rather than rumors and social standing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, but tonight, under the vast Arizona sky, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The third night found them camped beside an ancient oak that had somehow survived centuries in this harsh country. Its gnarled branches stretched wide, offering shelter from the desert wind that carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Cassandra had grown more comfortable with the rhythms of travel, the early morning starts, the midday rests, the careful rationing of water and food. Her hands, once soft from a life of books and chalkboards, were developing calluses. Her skin had darkened under the desert sun, despite Nahuel's efforts to keep them in shade during the worst heat. She was changing, she realized, becoming something harder and more practical than the woman who'd left Copper Ridge. "Tell me about the schoolhouse," Nahuel said suddenly as they sat by the fire, sharing roasted rabbit he'd caught with a snare. The question surprised her. In their days together, he'd spoken little, and never about her past. She looked across the flames at him, trying to read his expression. "What do you want to know?" "What you taught. Why it mattered to you." Cassandra pulled her blanket closer against the night chill. "Literature, mostly, history, arithmetic when necessary." She smiled despite herself. "The children in Copper Ridge weren't particularly interested in poetry, but I persisted." Poetry. There was something in his voice, Not mockery, but curiosity. You disapprove? I'm wondering why someone would teach children about beauty in a place like Copper Ridge. The insight surprised her. Because they needed to know it existed, that there was more to the world than dust and disappointment. She studied his face across the firelight. You understand that, don't you? The need for something beyond survival? Nahuel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. The priests at San Xavier taught us about beauty too. They called it God's grace, shining through even the darkest places. Did you believe them? For a while. His voice carried old pain. Until I learned that their God's grace had very specific conditions. Cassandra felt the weight of untold stories in those words. What happened? Nahuel picked up a stick and stirred the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. They wanted to save us from being Apache, make us into something more. Acceptable. Cut our hair. Forbid our language. Teach us that everything our people believed was wrong. But you stayed. For 8 years. Learned to read Latin, studied their scriptures, even considered taking vows. He looked up at her, firelight dancing in his dark eyes. I was good at being what they wanted, until the day they told me I could never go home again. Why not? Because home was the place of savages, and I was supposed to be civilized now. The bitterness in his voice was sharp as broken glass. They said my people would corrupt the salvation they'd worked so hard to build in me. Cassandra felt her heart clench with recognition. So you left. I ran in the middle of the night, like a thief stealing his own life back. Nahuel set down the stick and looked at her directly. When I found my people again, I'd been gone so long I might as well have been a stranger. Too Apache for the mission. Too mission for the Apache. Is that when you became the blood hunter? Names grow from what people need them to mean. The whites needed a monster to blame for their fears. My people needed someone who could move between both worlds. He shrugged. I became what was necessary. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Cassandra found herself thinking about the parallels in their stories, both of them caught between worlds, both transformed by the expectations of others into something they'd never chosen to be. What was his name? Nahuel asked eventually. The one who accused you. Cassandra's hands tightened on her blanket. She'd been hoping to avoid this conversation, but something about the honest pain in Nahuel's story made her feel safe enough to share her own. Marcus Wade. His father owns half of Copper Ridge. Tell me. So she did. The words came haltingly at first. Then, in a rush, she told him about Marcus's persistence, his increasingly inappropriate comments, the way he'd lingered after lessons with transparent excuses, about her careful rejections, always polite, always proper, mindful of his father's influence in the community. He was 18, she said, staring into the fire, old enough to understand what no meant, but young enough to believe the world owed him whatever he wanted. And when you refused him, he decided I was either going to submit to him or be destroyed by him. The memory still stung like an open wound. He told everyone I'd made advances toward him, that I was a desperate spinster who'd forgotten her place. Nahuel's jaw tightened. They believed him. Of course they did. He was Harold Wade's son. I was just a teacher from Ohio with no family, no connections, no one to speak for me. She laughed bitterly. The same women who'd praised my dedication to education suddenly remembered every time I'd spoken too freely or expressed an opinion they thought too bold for a woman. And the theft? Cassandra closed her eyes, remembering those desperate final days. 3 days without food, my savings gone, no work to be found, landlord threatening eviction. I saw a loaf of bread cooling on a windowsill and I took it. She looked up at him. 15 cents worth of bread, and it condemned me. Not the bread, Nahuel said quietly. The fear. People were afraid of what you represented. What did I represent? Independence, intelligence, the possibility that a woman could exist without needing their approval. His eyes met hers across the fire. Dangerous things in a place like Copper Ridge. The insight hit her like a physical blow. She'd spent months wondering what she'd done wrong, how she could have prevented the destruction of her life. But Nahuel was right. Her real crime hadn't been rejecting Marcus Wade or stealing bread. It had been refusing to be small enough for their comfort. "So they traded me to the monster," she said. "To the legend of the monster, there's a difference." "Is there?" Nahuel stood and moved to check on his horse, but Cassandra caught the tension in his shoulders. When he returned to the fire, his expression was carefully neutral. "You want to know if the stories are true?" It wasn't a question. Cassandra nodded, suddenly uncertain she wanted the answer. "Some of them. War makes monsters of men who might have been peaceful in other times." His voice was steady, matter of fact. "I've killed whites. I've taken their property, burned their buildings, made them afraid to venture beyond their walls. But I've never harmed a child, never taken a woman against her will, never killed a man who wasn't trying to kill me or mine." He met her eyes. "The rest of the stories, the scalping, the torture, the mindless savagery, those belong to the legend, not the man. Why tell me this?" "Because you have a right to know who you're traveling with. And because—" He hesitated, then continued. "Because surviving out here means learning to see people as they are, not as stories paint them." The fire crackled between them, and Cassandra felt something shift in the air. A deepening of trust, perhaps, or simply the recognition of two souls who'd been judged by the stories others told about them. "Teach me," she said suddenly. "Teach you what?" "To survive, to see the signs you see, read the land the way you do." She leaned forward, surprising herself with her intensity. "I don't want to be helpless anymore." Nahuel studied her for a long moment. "It's not easy. Desert doesn't forgive mistakes." Neither did Copper Ridge. Something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Tomorrow. Then we start with water." "Water?" "How to find it, how to save it, how to know when you're drinking too little or too much." He gestured toward the darkness beyond their fire. "Everything else builds from that." As they prepared for sleep, Cassandra felt a strange sense of anticipation. For the first time since leaving Ohio, she was moving towards something instead of away from it. The desert might be harsh, but it was honest. It would test her, push her, maybe even kill her, but it wouldn't lie to her. "Nahuel," she said into the darkness after they'd banked the fire. "Yes?" "Thank you for not being the monster they thought you were." His answer came soft as the desert wind. "Thank you for not being the victim they tried to make you." Under the vast canopy of stars, Cassandra Mitchell closed her eyes and dreamed not of her past but of her future, unknown, uncharted, and finally, blessedly, her own to choose. The fifth morning dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of another scorching day ahead. Cassandra woke to find Nahuel already checking his gear, his movements efficient and purposeful. Over the past days, she'd begun to learn his rhythms, the way he scanned the horizon each morning, the careful attention he paid to his horse's condition, the subtle signs that told him when weather might change. "Today we practiced tracking," he said without preamble, handing her a piece of dried meat and a small portion of water. "Desert teaches through doing, not talking." She'd grown to appreciate his direct manner. After years of Copper Ridge's elaborate social courtesies that masked cruelty, Nahuel's straightforward honesty was refreshing. When he said something, he meant it. They'd been traveling for less than an hour when Ayanna suddenly lifted her head, ears pricked forward. Nahuel's hand went immediately to the rifle slung across his back, his entire body shifting into alert stillness. "What is it?" Cassandra whispered. "Listen." She strained her ears, trying to hear whatever had caught their attention. At first, there was only the usual desert quiet wind through dry grass, the distant call of a hawk. Then she heard it, a thin, high sound that made her blood run cold. Children crying, We keep moving, Noel said, his voice flat and final. But Cassandra had already spotted the column of smoke rising in the distance, dark against the morning sky. Her teacher's instincts, dormant for months, surged to life. There are children out there. Not our concern. They're crying. Deserts full of sounds that fool the ear. Nahuel's grip tightened on his reins, but he didn't urge Ayanna forward. Could be a trap. Could be Apache business. Could be white man's war. None of it our fight. Cassandra stared at the smoke, her heart hammering. She understood his caution. They were two people alone in dangerous country, with no obligation to anyone but themselves. But the sound of those children... I'm going to look, she said quietly. No. I'm not asking permission. Nahuel turned to face her fully, his dark eyes holding warning. You don't understand what you're walking into. This isn't a schoolhouse where the worst danger is a scraped knee. Those children are in trouble. And we will be too, if we interfere. The crying came again. Fainter now, but unmistakably the sound of young voices in distress. Cassandra felt something break open inside her chest. Months of helplessness, of being acted upon rather than acting, of watching terrible things happen without the power to prevent them. I spent my whole adult life trying to protect children, she said, meeting his gaze steadily. I won't stop now because it's dangerous. You'll stop because it's suicide. Maybe, but I'd rather die trying to help them than live knowing I walked away. They stared at each other across a gulf of fundamental difference. Nahuel had survived by choosing his battles carefully, by understanding that every act of compassion in this harsh country carried a price. Cassandra had built her life on the belief that children deserved protection, regardless of cost. This is foolishness, he said finally. Probably. You have no weapons, no skills for fighting. I have hands. I can carry water, tend wounds, comfort the afraid. Nahuel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. The smoke in the distance grew thicker, and the crying seemed to be getting weaker. If we do this, he said slowly, we do it my way. You follow my lead. Ask no questions. Do exactly as I say. You'll help? I'll try to keep you alive while you help. His expression was grim. There's a difference. They approached the source of the smoke carefully, Nahuel leading them through dry washes and behind rock formations that offered concealment. As they drew closer, the acrid smell of burning wood grew stronger, mixed with something else that made Cassandra's stomach clench. The homestead had been small and isolated, a log cabin with a lean-to barn, a kitchen garden now trampled and burned. The main building was still smoldering, its roof partially collapsed. Bodies lay scattered in the yard, and Cassandra had to fight not to be sick. Raiders, Nahuel said quietly, studying the scene. Apache, from the looks of it, but they're long gone. How can you tell? Tracks are old. Horses' hooves have hardened edges in the dirt. Fire's been burning for hours. He pointed to scuff marks in the dust. They took some captives, but left in a hurry. The crying came again, and this time Cassandra could pinpoint its source, a root cellar behind the house, its heavy wooden door partially ajar. There, she breathed. Nahuel held up a hand, listening intently. Then he nodded. 3 children, maybe 4, young from the sound. They approached the cellar cautiously. Nahuel called out in Apache first, then in English. We're here to help. Are you hurt? The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by terrified silence. My name is Cassandra, she called softly, using the voice she'd perfected for frightened students. We're not going to hurt you. Can you tell me your names? A tiny voice answered from the darkness. I'm Emma. My brother Billy's here, and baby Sarah. But Billy got burned and he won't wake up. Cassandra looked at Nahuel, who nodded grimly. They pulled open the cellar door, revealing 3 children huddled in the earthen space below. Emma looked to be about 8, with tangled blonde hair and a dress torn and stained with soot. Billy appeared older, perhaps 10, but he lay unconscious against the cellar wall, angry red burns visible on his arms and face. The baby, Sarah, couldn't have been more than 2 years old. "Where are your parents?" Cassandra asked gently as she climbed down into the cellar. "Papa went to fight," Emma said through her tears. "Mama made us hide down here when the bad men came. She said not to come out no matter what we heard." Cassandra's heart clenched as she understood. The children's mother had hidden them and then faced the raiders alone, buying her children's lives with her own. "Billy needs help," she said to Nahuel, who had followed her into the cellar. "Those burns are serious." Nahuel examined the boy quickly, his hands surprisingly gentle. "Smoke inhalation, too. We need to get him to the fort." "Fort?" "Fort Bowie, maybe 20 miles east. They'll have a doctor." Cassandra looked around the cramped cellar, then at the 3 orphaned children. Emma was trying to be brave, but tears streaked the dirt on her face. Baby Sarah whimpered softly, and Billy's breathing was labored and shallow. "We can't carry them all," she said. "We can try." Nahuel was already calculating logistics. "Ayana can carry the boy and baby. We walk, take turns carrying the girl when she tires. That's a full day's travel with children. Less if we push hard." His eyes met hers. "But you're right, it's dangerous. Very dangerous." "More dangerous than leaving them here?" "Different dangerous." Nahuel climbed out of the cellar and surveyed the burned homestead again. "Raiders might come back, or other Apache who wouldn't be as understanding about what we're doing. Understanding? Helping white children makes me a traitor to some of my people, especially after what happened here." He gestured toward the bodies in the yard. "Blood calls for blood in these times." Cassandra felt the weight of what he was risking for her conscience. "You don't have to do this." "Neither do you." "Yes, I do." Something in her voice must have convinced him. Nahuel nodded once, then began preparing for the journey ahead. He fashioned a makeshift stretcher for Billy using a blanket and 2 broken fence posts, designed to secure to Ayana's saddle. Baby Sarah could ride in front of him, held safely in place. "Emma," Cassandra said gently, "we're going to take you somewhere safe. Can you be very brave for me?" The little girl nodded solemnly. "Will Billy be okay?" "We're going to do everything we can for him." As they prepared to leave, Nahuel took one last look around the destroyed homestead. "This changes things," he said quietly. "How?" "Word will spread about this raid. Tensions will get worse. And when we show up at Fort Bowie with these children," he shook his head, "some will see it as proof that not all Apache are enemies. Others will see it as a trick." "What will you see it as?" Nahuel lifted the unconscious Billy onto the stretcher with careful hands. "A choice that can't be undone." They set out under the climbing sun, 2 unlikely protectors leading 3 orphaned children across dangerous country toward an uncertain welcome. Behind them, smoke continued to rise from the ruins of what had been a family's home. Ahead lay 20 miles of desert, Apache territory, and the hope that they could reach help before it was too late. As they walked, Emma slipped her small hand into Cassandra's, trusting in the way only children could. For the first time since leaving Copper Ridge, Cassandra felt the familiar weight of responsibility, not for her own survival, but for lives more precious and fragile than her own. "Thank you," she said to Nahuel as they crested a hill and Fort Bowie appeared in the distance, still many hours away. "Don't thank me yet," he replied, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. "We're not there yet." But Cassandra was grateful anyway, not just for his help, but for the reminder of who she truly was beneath all the fear and survival. She was a teacher, a protector of children, and no amount of desert hardship could change that fundamental truth. The journey to Fort Bowie stretched before them like a test of endurance that would push them all to their limits. Billy's condition worsened as the hours passed, his breathing becoming more labored, his fever climbing despite their efforts to keep him cool. Baby Sarah cried intermittently, confused and frightened by the strange faces and the jolting motion of travel. Emma proved to be remarkably resilient. The 8-year-old walked beside Cassandra for hours without complaint, though her small legs had to work twice as hard to match their pace. When she finally began to stumble with exhaustion, Nawel wordlessly lifted her onto Ayana's back behind Billy's stretcher. "I can walk more," Emma protested weakly. "Save your strength," Cassandra told her gently. "We might need your help with the baby later." The lie came easily, anything to give the child a sense of purpose rather than helplessness. Emma nodded seriously, understanding her important role in their small group. As they traveled, Cassandra found herself watching Nawel with growing amazement. The man who'd been painted as a merciless killer moved with infinite gentleness around the children. When Billy stirred and cried out in pain, Nawel was there immediately, checking his injuries and offering what comfort he could. When baby Sarah fussed, he sang to her in Apache low, melodic songs that seemed to calm her fears. "Where did you learn to do that?" Cassandra asked during one of their brief rest stops, nodding towards Sarah, who had finally fallen asleep in Nawel's arms. "My sister had children," he said simply, "before the soldiers came to our village." The past tense wasn't lost on her. "What happened to them?" Nawel's expression closed off, becoming the careful mask she'd learned to recognize. "War happened." She didn't press for details, but the pain in his voice explained much about the man he'd become, and why rescuing these white children must be tearing at old wounds. By midday, the heat had become unbearable. They sought shelter under a cluster of mesquite trees, but even in the shade, the air shimmered with heat waves. Billy's fever spiked, and he began to thrash deliriously. "We need to cool him down," Cassandra said. But their water supplies were carefully rationed for the journey ahead. Without hesitation, Nawel poured precious water onto his bandana and placed it on Billy's forehead. "We'll find more water," he said when he saw her expression. "Children can't wait." It was then that Cassandra truly understood the magnitude of what he was sacrificing. Not just the water, though that was precious enough in the desert. Not just the risk to his own safety, though traveling with white children made him a target from all sides. He was risking his very identity, his place among his own people, his carefully constructed reputation, everything he'd built to survive in this harsh land. "Why?" she asked quietly, while Emma played with pebbles nearby and the baby slept. "Why risk so much for children who aren't your own?" Nawel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I couldn't save my sister's children. Because I stood and watched while soldiers burned our village and took the young ones to schools that would kill everything Apache in them." He looked down at Billy's flushed face. "Maybe I can't undo what was done, but I can make sure these 3 don't die alone in the desert." The raw pain in his words hit her like a physical blow. She wanted to offer comfort, but knew that some wounds went too deep for easy consolation. Instead, she reached out and touched his hand briefly, a gesture of understanding between 2 people who'd both lost everything they'd once held dear. They resumed travel as the afternoon heat began to ease, pushing hard toward Fort Bowie. Emma rode now without protest, her small body drooping with exhaustion. Baby Sarah had developed a rash from the heat and cried fitfully. Billy drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words that made no sense. It was Emma who spotted the dust cloud first. "Someone's coming," she said, pointing toward the eastern horizon. Nawel immediately guided them toward a rocky outcropping that offered some concealment. His hand went to his rifle as he studied the approaching riders. "Cavalry patrol," he said after a moment. 6 men. "That's good, isn't it?" Cassandra asked. "They can help us get the children to the fort." "Maybe." Nawel's expression was grim. "Or maybe they'll shoot first and ask questions later when they see an Apache with white children." The reality of their situation hit her fully for the first time. To the approaching soldiers, Nawel would look like exactly what the stories painted him as, A raider who'd taken captives. The fact that he was trying to save the children would be lost in the moment of confrontation. "Give me your rifle," she said suddenly. "What? Your rifle? Give it to me." When he hesitated, she explained quickly. "If I'm holding the weapon, you're clearly not the threat. It changes the entire picture. You don't know how to use it." "I don't have to. I just have to hold it." She met his eyes steadily. "Trust me." After a moment's hesitation, Nahuel handed over his rifle. Cassandra checked to make sure the safety was engaged, then positioned herself slightly in front of him as the cavalry patrol approached. The soldiers came at a gallop, dust flying from their horses' hooves. Their leader, a captain with a graying beard, called for a halt when he saw their small group. "You there! Step away from that Apache!" "Captain," Cassandra called out, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned from years of managing classroom situations. "These children need medical attention immediately. The boy has severe burns and smoke inhalation." The captain's eyes took in the scene: a white woman holding a rifle, an Apache warrior standing peacefully beside an injured child, and two other children who were clearly in distress. It wasn't what he'd expected to find. "Ma'am, are you being held against your will?" "Absolutely not. This man saved these children from a raider attack on their homestead. We're trying to get them to Fort Bowie for medical care." One of the younger soldiers spurred his horse forward. "Captain, that's the one they call Blood Hunter. I seen the wanted posters." Tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. Cassandra felt Nahuel tense behind her, ready to fight or flee if necessary. But she stepped forward, placing herself clearly between the soldiers and the man who'd become her unlikely protector. "Sergeant," she said, addressing the young soldier directly, "do you see any blood here, any violence? Or do you see a man who's spent the last 6 hours carrying an injured child through the desert heat?" The captain urged his horse closer, studying Billy's unconscious form. "Those burns are bad. Kid needs a doctor soon." "Which is why we're asking for your help, not your suspicion." "Ma'am, you don't understand. That Apache has a name. It's Nahuel, and he's done more to help these children than anyone else has." Cassandra's voice carried steel beneath the politeness. "Now, are you going to help us save a child's life? Or are you going to let him die while you debate the politics?" The captain looked from Billy to Nahuel to Cassandra, clearly struggling with a situation that didn't fit any of his preconceptions. Finally, he dismounted. "Corporal Hayes, give me your water. Thompson, we'll need to rig a better stretcher." He looked at Nahuel directly for the first time. "Can you keep up on foot?" "Yes." "Then let's move. That boy doesn't have much time." The ride to Fort Bowie became a blur of dust and desperate urgency. The soldiers had horses to spare, and Cassandra found herself mounted behind one of the troopers, still holding Nahuel's rifle. Emma rode with another soldier, her eyes wide with the sudden change in their circumstances. Nahuel jogged alongside the horses with seemingly tireless endurance, his focus entirely on Billy, who had been transferred to a proper military stretcher. As the fort's walls came into view, Cassandra realized that this moment would change everything. Word would spread about the Apache warrior who'd helped rescue white children, about the woman who'd defended him to cavalry soldiers. Some would see it as proof that peace was possible. Others would see it as betrayal or weakness. But as she watched Nahuel check on Billy one more time, his face etched with genuine concern for a child he'd never met before that morning, Cassandra knew that whatever consequences followed, they'd made the right choice. Sometimes, she thought, the most important battles weren't fought with weapons or words, but with simple acts of human decency that refused to acknowledge the boundaries others tried to impose. In saving these children, perhaps they'd also saved something more precious: the possibility that mercy could exist even in the midst of a harsh and unforgiving war. Fort Bowie erupted into controlled chaos the moment their small party arrived at the gates. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the post surgeon, took one look at Billy's condition and immediately commandeered the infirmary. Soldiers scattered to relay news of the Apache raid to Colonel James Patterson, while others gathered to stare at the unprecedented sight of the notorious blood hunter walking peacefully among them. Cassandra found herself swept along in the urgent activity, helping to transfer the children while keeping a careful eye on Nahuel. The soldiers' attitudes toward him ranged from suspicious curiosity to barely contained hostility. She noticed how he positioned himself always near an exit, ready to flee if the situation turned dangerous. "Ma'am," Captain Reynolds, the patrol leader, approached her as doctor. Morrison worked on Billy. "Colonel Patterson wants to see you and him in his office immediately. The children will be cared for." The colonel's orders were clear. Cassandra looked at Nahuel, who nodded slightly. They followed Captain Reynolds across the fort's dusty parade ground, drawing stares from every soldier they passed. Fort Bowie was a rough frontier outpost, built to withstand Apache raids, and the sight of an Apache warrior walking freely through its heart was unprecedented. Colonel Patterson's office was spartanly furnished but reflected military efficiency. Maps covered the walls, marked with pins indicating recent Apache activity. The colonel himself was a weathered man in his 50s, with gray hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He studied them both as they entered, his expression unreadable. "Miss Mitchell, is it?" Patterson's voice was courteous but cautious. "Captain Reynolds tells me you've had quite an adventure." "Yes, sir. These children needed help." "And you? Nahuel." The colonel's use of his actual name rather than the feared sobriquet was deliberate. "Captain Reynolds says you aided in rescuing white children from an Apache raid." "Yes." Patterson leaned back in his chair. "That puts me in a difficult position. You're wanted for numerous raids against settlers. Yet, here you are, apparently saving the lives of 3 white children." "I am here," Nahuel said carefully, "because children were dying." "Noble sentiment, but it doesn't erase what you've done before." Tension filled the room like smoke. Cassandra could see the military logic at work. Here was one of the most wanted Apache warriors in the territory, practically delivering himself to the fort. The temptation to arrest him must be enormous. Before she could speak, commotion erupted outside. Shouts, the thunder of many horses, the sharp crack of rifle fire. Patterson was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. "Apache war party," he said grimly. "Looks like 50 or more." Through the window, Cassandra could see warriors spreading across the hills surrounding the fort, their war paint visible even at a distance. More shots rang out as sentries opened fire from the walls. "They're not attacking," Nahuel observed, studying the positioning. "This is a demonstration." "Demonstration of what?" "Strength. They know I'm here." Patterson turned from the window, his face grim with understanding. "They've come for you." "Not to rescue me, to kill me." Nahuel's voice was matter-of-fact. "Helping white children marks me as a traitor. They cannot let that stand." The implications hit Cassandra like a physical blow. By saving Emma, Billy, and Sarah, Nahuel had signed his own death warrant with his own people. The Apache outside weren't here to free him. They were here to execute him for betraying everything they believed the war represented. "Sir," Captain Reynolds burst through the door without ceremony. "The Apache leader wants to parley. He's asking for the traitor to be delivered to them." "And if we refuse?" "They'll attack the fort. They have the numbers to overrun us." Patterson looked at Nahuel, weighing options. "What's your assessment?" "They mean what they say, and they have enough warriors to carry it out." Nahuel moved away from the window. "But attacking this fort will cost them many lives. Some of their leaders know this." More gunfire erupted outside, closer this time. Through the window, Cassandra could see soldiers running to defensive positions along the walls. In the infirmary, Doctor Morrison would be working frantically to save Billy while Emma and baby Sarah waited in terror. "There might be another way," Nahuel said quietly. "I'm listening. Let me talk to them, not as a prisoner being delivered, but as a mediator. Patterson's eyebrows rose. You'd risk that? Some of those warriors out there are young, angry, looking for any excuse to spill blood. Others remember when peace was possible. Nahuel met the colonel's eyes. Maybe I can convince them that this fight isn't worth the cost. And if you can't, then you lose nothing you wouldn't lose anyway. A bullet shattered the office window, sending glass fragments across the floor. The attack was beginning in earnest now. Probing strikes to test the fort's defenses. In the distance, Cassandra could hear Emma crying for her mother. "Sir," she said suddenly, "I want to go with him." Both men stared at her. "Absolutely not," Patterson said. "They came because an Apache helped white children. Maybe they need to see that white people can return that trust." "It's suicide." "Maybe. But those children are alive because this man risked everything to save them. Now he's risking everything again to save this fort." She looked directly at Nahuel. "I won't let him face his people alone." "Cassandra, this is my choice." Nahuel studied her face, seeing the same stubborn courage that had driven her to rescue the children. Finally, he nodded. "It might help, or it might get us both killed. Then we'll die together." Patterson ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling with the decision. Outside, the gunfire was intensifying. "This is madness." "So is letting good people die because we're too afraid to try something different," Cassandra replied. After a long moment, Patterson nodded grimly. "God help us all." The walk across the parade ground to the fort's main gate felt like a journey to the scaffold. Soldiers stared as they passed, many making the sign of the cross. Captain Reynolds had insisted on a white flag, though Cassandra doubted it would mean much to warriors who considered Nahuel a traitor. At the gate, Nahuel paused and looked at her one final time. "You can still change your mind." "So can you." "No, I can't." His expression was peaceful, resolved. "But you have a life ahead of you. Children who might still need a teacher. And you have people who need to understand that mercy isn't weakness." The massive wooden gate swung open, revealing the desert beyond where 50 Apache warriors waited in a rough semicircle. Their war paint was stark against the afternoon sun, their weapons ready. At their center sat a man Cassandra recognized from Nahuel's tense posture as someone significant, perhaps a war chief or respected elder. They walked forward together, two figures silhouetted against the vast Arizona landscape, carrying with them the hopes of children who needed protecting and the possibility that understanding might triumph over vengeance. Behind them, the soldiers of Fort Bowie watched in tense silence. Ahead, the Apache warriors waited to render judgment on one of their own who had chosen compassion over tribal loyalty. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and the distant smell of gun smoke. In the infirmary, Billy fought for his life while Emma and Sarah waited for adults to decide whether the world would be safe enough for children to grow up in. As they approached the waiting warriors, Cassandra felt Nahuel's hand brush against hers, not holding, but acknowledging. Whatever happened next, they would face it as they had faced everything else since leaving Devil's Canyon, together, with courage born from the understanding that some choices transcend survival. The fate of 3 orphaned children, a frontier fort, and 2 people who had found unexpected trust in each other's integrity now rested in the hands of warriors who would have to choose between the bitter satisfaction of revenge and the harder path of mercy. The Apache war chief who sat at the center of the semicircle was older than Cassandra had expected, his weathered face marked by years of warfare and loss. Scars crossed his chest and arms, and his eyes held the terrible wisdom of someone who had seen too much death. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Nahuel of the Chiricahua, you come before us marked by the touch of our enemies." Nahuel stopped 20 paces from the assembled warriors. Cassandra, beside him, she could feel the hostility radiating from the younger men, their hands gripping weapons with barely restrained violence. But the older warriors watched with careful eyes, weighing what they saw. I come before you. Mangas. Nahuel replied, using what Cassandra assumed was the chief's name, as I have always come, as one who seeks to protect life. You protect the children of those who murder our people, who burn our villages and steal our land. Mangas's voice carried decades of accumulated rage. You have forgotten who you are. I remember exactly who I am. Nahuel's voice remained steady, though Cassandra could see the tension in his shoulders. I am the son of Stormwalker, grandson of White Eagle. I am Apache, but I am also a man who refuses to let children die when I have the power to save them. A young warrior with fresh war paint across his cheeks spurred his horse forward. Children of our enemies! You should have left them to feed the buzzards. And if they were Apache children in the hands of white soldiers, would you say the same? The question hung in the desert air like smoke. Several of the warriors shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering their own children taken to distant schools or killed in cavalry raids. Mangas raised his hand for silence. You speak of Apache children as if they are the same as white children. They are not. These people make war on us. They take our land, kill our people, destroy our way of life. And so we must become like them. Nahuel stepped forward, and Cassandra saw several rifles swing in his direction. We must kill children to prove we are strong. We must kill our enemies to survive. The children I saved were not my enemies. They were innocents, caught in a war they did not choose. Nahuel's voice grew stronger, more passionate. Emma, 8 years old, who hid in a root cellar while her mother died protecting her. Billy, 10 years old, burned trying to save his baby sister. Sarah, too young to understand why the world has become fire and blood. These were my enemies? Cassandra watched the faces of the warriors as Nahuel spoke. The younger ones remained unmoved, their hatred too fresh and hot to be cooled by words. But some of the older men were listening with expressions that suggested doubt. You have lived too long among the whites. Another warrior called out, You have forgotten the taste of our blood on their hands. I have forgotten nothing. Pain flashed across Nahuel's features. I remember my sister's children, taken by blue-coat soldiers. I remember villages burned, families scattered like leaves in the wind. But I also remember what my grandmother taught me, that we are people of honor, not animals driven by revenge. Pretty words, the young warrior sneered. But words do not bring back the dead. Neither does killing innocents. Mangas held up his hand again, and the arguing stopped. He studied Nahuel with ancient eyes, then turned his attention to Cassandra. When he spoke to her, his English was careful but clear. White woman, why do you stand beside one you should fear? Cassandra felt every eye upon her, Apache and white alike. In the distance, she could see soldiers positioned along Fort Bowie's walls, rifles trained on the gathering. Her answer here might determine whether this ended in understanding or bloodshed. Because I have learned that fear and wisdom are not the same thing, she said carefully. I feared this man when I first met him, because of stories I'd been told, but stories lie. Actions tell the truth. And what truth have his actions told you? That he is a man who shares his water with the thirsty, his food with the hungry, who carries injured children through the desert heat, who risks his life to save those who cannot save themselves. She looked directly at Mangas. That he is a man of honor, just as he claims. Honor. Mangas seemed to taste the word. This is an interesting concept, coming from people who break every treaty they sign. I cannot speak for all white people, just as you cannot speak for all Apache, but I can speak for what I have witnessed. Cassandra's voice grew stronger. I have seen this man choose mercy when he could have chosen vengeance. I have seen him risk everything to save children who were strangers to him. If that is not honor, then the word has no meaning. A long silence followed her words. The wind whispered through the desert grass, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. Then one of the older warriors spoke up. I knew Stormwalker, Nahuel's father. He once spared the life of a white trader who was lost in the desert. The trader later helped broker peace talks that lasted 2 seasons. He looked around at his companions. Perhaps the son carries his father's wisdom. Or his father's weakness, the young warrior retorted. Ayana, Mangas said suddenly, and Nahuel's horse trotted forward as if called. The war chief studied the paint mare with knowing eyes. Your grandmother's horse. She still lives. She remembers you, Nahuel said softly. As I remember her, and your grandmother's stories about the balance of all things. Mangas was quiet for a long moment. She would say that too much weight on either side breaks the scales. She would say that children are sacred, regardless of the color of their skin. Perhaps. Mangas dismounted and walked toward them, his movements deliberate and peaceful. When he stood before Nahuel, he placed a weathered hand on the younger man's shoulder. You have chosen a difficult path. Nephew, it will make you enemies among our people and their people both. I know. But it may also be the only path that leads anywhere but mutual destruction. Mangas turned to address his warriors. This man has acted with honor. Even if we question his judgment, we will not shed his blood today. The young warrior who had spoken most aggressively spurred his horse forward. And what of our dead? What of justice? Justice is not the same as revenge. Mangas replied firmly. We will remember our dead by living with honor, not by becoming the monsters our enemies believe us to be. Not all the warriors looked satisfied, but none challenged their chief's decision. Gradually, they began to withdraw, melting back into the desert as silently as they had appeared. The immediate crisis was over. As the last of the Apache riders disappeared into the shimmering heat, Cassandra and Nahuel walked back toward Fort Bowie. The gates stood open, and she could see Colonel Patterson waiting with obvious relief. It's over? Patterson asked as they approached. For now, Nahuel replied. But this changes things. I can't go back to my people, and I can't stay here. Where will you go? Nahuel looked at Cassandra, and she saw a question in his dark eyes. I don't know yet. 3 days later, Dr. Morrison declared Billy out of danger. The boy's burns were healing, and his breathing had returned to normal. Emma had attached herself to Cassandra with the fierce loyalty of a child who had found safety in chaos. Baby Sarah had begun to smile again. They'll need families, Colonel Patterson said as they watched the children play in the fort's courtyard. Good people willing to take in orphans. I know, Cassandra said quietly. That evening, as the sun set over the Arizona mountains, she found Nahuel sitting outside the fort's walls, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Ayana grazed nearby, content in the desert grasses. I've been thinking about what you said, Cassandra said as she settled beside him. About teaching children to see beyond the stories they're told. And there's a valley about 50 miles north of here. Good water, protected from the worst weather. It could support a small settlement. What kind of settlement? The kind where Apache children and white children could learn together, where they could discover that the person sitting next to them is just another child, not an enemy. She looked at him directly. The kind of place that would need a teacher who understands both worlds, and a protector who's trusted by neither side. Perhaps they'd learn to trust us because we trusted each other. Nahuel was quiet for a long moment, studying the stars. It would be dangerous. There would be people on both sides who would see it as a threat. Most worthwhile things are dangerous. We might fail. We might succeed. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight, she saw the man who had offered her water when she was dying of thirst, food when she was starving, protection when she was defenseless. The man who had risked everything to save 3 children who meant nothing to him except that they needed saving. A school, he said thoughtfully. A school where children learn that the world is bigger than their fears. Where they learn that stories can lie, but actions tell the truth. Where they learn that courage isn't the absence of fear, but choosing to do what's right despite the fear, as if drawn by their conversation. Emma appeared from the fort, followed by Billy walking slowly but steadily, and a soldier carrying baby Sarah. The children settled around them like a small constellation, trusting in the safety these two unlikely guardians represented. "Will you really build a school?" Emma asked with the directness only children possessed. Cassandra looked at Nahuel, seeing her own hope reflected in his eyes. "Yes," she said, "we will." Under the vast Arizona sky, surrounded by children who had learned that adults could be trusted to keep them safe, Cassandra Mitchell and Nahuel began to plan for a future neither could have imagined when they first met in Devil's Canyon. It would be hard work, building something new from the ashes of old hatred. But they had learned that the most important construction always began with a foundation of trust, courage, and the stubborn belief that tomorrow could be better than today. The desert wind carried the scent of possibility, and for the first time in either of their lives, the horizon looked like a place of hope rather than exile.